Ethan had been riding since early morning, planning to reach his ranch before nightfall. Winter in the high plains was always unpredictable, but he thought he still had a few hours before the next storm arrived. The sky had looked heavy at sunrise, but the air had been calm then, and he had trusted his experience. Cowboys learned to read the land like a book, and Ethan usually knew which warnings to listen to. This time, he misjudged the speed of the storm. It came rolling over the mountains much earlier than expected. By noon, the wind had already picked up. The soft, distant snowflakes that had begun to fall around midday were now sharp bits of ice hitting his face. He wrapped the scarf tighter around his neck and tapped his horse's side, trying to hurry along. But the wind only grew stronger. Soon the world around him turned white, an endless sheet of blowing snow. Even the tall pine trees nearby were barely visible, their shapes lost behind the wild storm. He had been through bad winters before, but this one felt different. It felt too fast, too heavy, too hungry. Ethan lowered his head, squinting to see the trail. His horse, Ranger, pushed through the deepening snow with slow, heavy steps. Ethan kept talking to him softly, telling him it would be all right, even though he knew the storm would only get worse. In weather like this, one wrong turn or one slow decision could cost a life. Cowboys did not fear storms, but they respected them. A man who stopped respecting nature usually did not survive long on the frontier. Several more minutes passed before Ethan felt something change in the air, something strange. Ranger suddenly lifted his head and snorted. Ethan frowned, pulling the reins gently. The horse sensed something ahead. Ethan trusted Ranger's instincts more than his own sometimes. He leaned forward and strained his eyes through the thick snow. At first he thought he was seeing shadows or tricks of the wind, but then he noticed movement. 3 shapes were stumbling across the trail, nearly swallowed by the blizzard. He blinked hard, unsure if he was imagining it. But no, the shapes were real. They were walking slowly, leaning on one another as if they had been fighting the storm for a long time. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Whoever they were in grave danger. No one should be out here on foot in weather like this. Without horses, without shelter, without enough clothing, they would not last much longer. He urged Ranger forward carefully. As he came closer, he recognized the details. An elderly native man, his long gray hair frozen with snow, an elderly native woman bent from the cold, and between them, a young woman holding up her mother with one arm while using her other arm to shield her eyes from the wind. All 3 looked exhausted. Their clothes were thin, meant for normal cold weather, not a deadly blizzard. Their skin was pale from the freezing wind. Their steps were slow and heavy, as if each foot felt like lifting a stone. The young woman was the first to notice Ethan approaching. She turned her head slightly, her dark eyes sharp even through the snow. She tried to straighten her back, but the weight of the storm pushed her down again. Ethan stopped his horse in front of them, raising one hand to show he meant no harm. The elderly couple looked up with tired eyes, their breaths short and uneven. "You folks all right?" Ethan called out, though he already knew the answer. The elderly man tried to speak, but his voice came out weak and broken. The young woman stepped forward instead. "Our wagon broke. Wheels snapped," she said, her words trembling from the cold. "We tried walking to town, but the storm came fast." Ethan looked behind them. The snow had already buried most of their tracks. The broken wagon was nowhere in sight. They must have walked for hours. He felt a shock run through him. They were lucky to still be standing at all. "How far have you been walking?" he asked gently. The young woman shook her head. "Since morning. We hope to find help." Ethan knew that meant trouble. Morning? They had been struggling long before the storm got bad. No wonder the parents looked close to collapsing. The mother's hands were shaking badly. The father's lips had turned pale blue. Ethan knew the signs. They were close to freezing. He quickly dismounted from Ranger and moved toward them. "You can't stay out here," he said firmly. "You'll freeze before you reach the settlement." The elderly man lifted his hand weakly, as if to protest. Ethan understood why. Not everyone trusted strangers on the plains. Tensions between different groups had been high in many places, and some families feared how cowboys might treat them. But Ethan had never been that type of man. He respected people, no matter where they came from. And right now, the storm was the real enemy. "I'm not here to harm you," Ethan said, lowering his voice so they could hear the sincerity. "I'm just trying to get you all to safety. Let me help." The young woman's eyes softened for a moment, though she still hesitated. She glanced at her parents. The old woman could barely stand. The old man leaned heavily on her, trying to stay upright. The daughter clenched her jaw, understanding that they had no choice. Trusting a stranger was risky, but staying out here was certain death. Ethan removed his coat and wrapped it around the older woman without waiting for permission. She flinched at first, but soon sighed as the warmth surrounded her. He then helped the elderly man onto Ranger. The old man protested weakly, saying Ethan needed the horse more than they did, but Ethan shook his head. "I'll walk," he said simply. "Right now you three need this more than I do." The young woman stepped forward to help her mother, gently lifting her onto the horse behind her father. Ethan then looked at the daughter. Her face was red from the cold, but her courage was clear. She shook her head when he tried to offer her a blanket. "Help them first," she insisted quietly. Ethan admired her strength. But he also saw her legs giving out. He grabbed another blanket from his saddlebag and wrapped it around her shoulders. She didn't protest this time. Her hands clutched the fabric tightly, as if she was afraid she might lose it to the wind. "Thank you," she whispered. The storm grew louder, pushing against all of them. Ethan knew they could not remain there. He had to act fast. He grabbed the reins and began leading the horse through the deep snow. "We're going to my cabin," he said loudly over the wind. "It's closer than town." "You'll be safe there." The young woman looked at him with surprise. So did her parents. They had expected he would take them toward the settlement. Instead, he was guiding them in the opposite direction toward the hills. None of them knew what to think. A stranger was taking full responsibility for their survival, despite knowing nothing about them. Ethan didn't look back. He walked with firm steps, cutting a path through the snow. Behind him, the family clung to the horse and held on to each other as the blizzard tried to pull them apart. The young woman watched Ethan's back closely. She didn't understand why a cowboy would risk so much for strangers. But one thing was clear: if he hadn't arrived when he did, they wouldn't have survived. Step by step, they followed him into the white storm, hoping the cabin was real. Hoping they would see shelter soon, hoping the cowboy who had appeared suddenly in the blizzard truly meant them no harm. Ethan led with determination, knowing their lives depended on every decision he made. The storm had trapped all of them together, and now their only chance of surviving was trusting a man they had met just minutes before. Ethan kept moving forward through the storm, pulling Ranger by the reins as the snow thickened around them. The wind felt like it wanted to push all four of them backward, but Ethan refused to slow down. He knew every minute spent out in this weather was dangerous. His boots sank deep into the snow with each step, but he kept walking, forcing a clear path for the horse. Behind him, the elderly couple clung to each other on the horse's back, and their daughter walked beside Ranger, one hand on the blanket around her shoulders and the other gripping the saddle for support. She tried her best to keep up, but the snow was uneven, and her legs were tired from hours of walking. Several times she stumbled, and each time Ethan immediately turned back to steady her. She would nod that she was fine, even when her legs clearly shook. She didn't want to be a burden, but Ethan wasn't thinking in terms of burden or trouble. In his mind, keeping them safe was the only thing that mattered. After nearly half an hour of slow progress, the young woman finally asked, her voice quiet and unsure, "Are we almost there?" Ethan glanced up at the hills ahead. The cabin was hidden in a grove of thick pines, far enough from the main trail that most people never found it. He had built it with his brother years ago, back when they still dreamed of starting a small cattle outpost together. Now, with his brother gone, the cabin stood mostly unused. Still, Ethan kept it in good shape because storms like this forced him to rely on it more than once. "We're getting close," he said, raising his voice so she could hear him over the wind. "Just a bit farther into the trees." The elderly man behind him nodded weakly. The mother leaned against her husband, barely awake, her eyes half closed. The young woman looked at her parents and swallowed hard. She knew they were reaching their limit. If Ethan didn't show up when he did, she feared they might have collapsed somewhere in the snow. The storm grew even stronger as they neared the tree line. Snow was falling so heavily that the world seemed to shrink around them. Ethan had to stop twice to clear his eyes. Ranger snorted and shook his head, uncomfortable with the icy flakes hitting his face. But Ethan kept going, pushing through snow that reached above his knees at times. Then finally, the first tall trees appeared through the white haze. The thick branches shielded them from the harshest wind, and the snow on the ground became a little easier to walk through. The daughter let out a breath she had been holding for a long time. Her shoulders relaxed for the first time since they started following Ethan. "See those trees?" Ethan said. "The cabin is just past them." The elderly man whispered something in his own language to his wife, a soft breath of hope. They both tightened their grip on the horse, trying to stay awake. Ethan led them between the pines, following a narrow path that barely existed anymore under the snow. The daughter watched closely, amazed that he knew where he was going when everything looked the same. She had never met someone who could navigate a storm like this. Cowboys learned to read the land, but Ethan did it with a calm confidence that made her trust him more with each step. Soon the roof of the cabin appeared through the trees, covered in snow. It was a small wooden building, simple but strong, with thick walls that could survive even the harshest winter. The windows were frosted and the door was partially blocked by snow, but smoke stains along the chimney showed it had been used many times before. "We're here," Ethan said quietly, though the relief in his voice was clear. The daughter let out a shaky breath, her eyes softening as she stared at the cabin. She had never expected to find shelter like this, especially not from a cowboy they had met in the worst storm of their lives. Ethan went straight to the door, pushing against the frozen wood. It didn't budge. Snow had piled up against it overnight. He stepped back and used his shoulder to push harder. The door creaked but didn't open. Seeing this, the young woman stepped forward. "Let me help," she said. Ethan shook his head at first, but she insisted, moving next to him. Together, they pushed again. This time the door cracked open, letting in a gust of cold air. Ethan cleared the snow inside with his boots and stepped into the dark room. The cabin was cold and quiet. The air smelled like old wood and pine. Ethan quickly went to the fireplace, grabbed dry logs he kept stored inside, and knelt down. He struck a match and held it to the kindling. Flames caught slowly, then grew, spreading warm light across the room. "Bring them in," he said without turning. The daughter guided the horse toward the cabin entrance. Ethan came out to help the elderly couple down. The mother nearly collapsed once her feet hit the ground, but Ethan caught her before she fell. He carried her gently inside and laid her near the fire. The elderly man followed with his daughter helping him. Ethan removed his gloves and rubbed his hands together, then checked the old woman's fingers for frostbite. Her hands were ice cold, but the color wasn't too dark. She would recover with warmth. He covered her with more blankets and placed another close to the fire to warm up, before wrapping it around the father. The daughter sank to her knees beside her parents, brushing snow from their faces. Her hands shook, not from cold but from fear slowly fading into relief. Ethan watched her quietly, then handed her a warm blanket as well. "You should warm up too," he said softly. She hesitated, looking at her parents first, but Ethan nodded toward the fire. "They're okay for now. They just need heat and rest." She finally wrapped herself in the blanket, sitting close to the flames. For the first time in hours, she felt warmth spreading back into her skin. Ethan then went to Ranger, brushed the snow off his back, and led him into the small shed beside the cabin. He gave the horse dry hay, water, and a place to rest. Ranger shook his head gratefully and pressed his nose against Ethan's arm before settling down. When Ethan returned to the cabin, the fire was burning bright, filling the room with a soft orange glow. The elderly couple was resting with their eyes closed, breathing slowly. The daughter was sitting on the floor near them, watching Ethan with a mix of tiredness and quiet surprise. "You took a big risk," she said softly, "bringing strangers to your own shelter." Ethan wiped snow from his hat and set it aside. "It wasn't a risk," he answered calmly. "It was the right thing to do." She studied him carefully. In her world, trust was something rare. People were cautious and guarded, especially during hard times. Yet here was a cowboy who gave everything, his coat, his shelter, his strength, without asking for anything in return. "You saved us," she whispered, still stunned at how quickly he acted when he barely knew them. Ethan shrugged lightly. Anyone would have done the same. But deep inside, she knew that wasn't true. Many travelers passed by people in trouble, pretending not to see or choosing not to get involved. She had seen kindness before, but not like this. Not from someone who had nothing to gain. As the fire warmed the room, the storm outside continued roaring. Snow beat against the roof, and the wind howled like a wild beast circling the cabin. But inside, the heat grew stronger, and the fear slowly melted away. Ethan prepared warm broth from provisions he kept stored. He served the elderly couple first, then offered a bowl to the daughter. She accepted it with both hands, drinking slowly. The warmth spread through her body, and she felt safe for the first time that day. "You never told us your name," she said finally. "Ethan," he replied. "And you?" "Ayanna." "Ayanna," he repeated, the name unfamiliar but gentle on his tongue. "Your parents?" "Running Bear and Night Willow," she said softly. Ethan nodded respectfully. "They're strong. They'll be okay after some rest." Ayanna looked at her parents and then back at Ethan. "If you hadn't found us—" "We don't need to think about that," Ethan interrupted gently. "You're here now. That's what matters." Ayanna lowered her eyes for a moment, feeling something she couldn't fully understand. Gratitude mixed with surprise, and perhaps a quiet admiration for the man who had turned his whole day around to save them. Outside, the storm raged like it planned to erase the world, but inside the small cabin, warmth grew stronger, and a sense of peace settled over them. Ethan moved around quietly, making sure everything was ready for the long night ahead. He prepared more firewood, checked the door, and placed extra blankets near Ayanna's parents. The elderly couple drifted into sleep, finally out of danger. Ayanna stayed awake a little longer, watching the cowboy who had changed their fate in a single moment. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. His next move had already shocked them. His kindness had saved their lives. The cabin was quiet now, the only sound coming from the crackling fire and the soft wind outside. The storm had not yet ended, but inside, the warmth wrapped around them like a protective blanket. Ethan moved quietly, making sure everything was in order. He stacked more logs on the fire, adjusted the blankets around the elderly couple, and checked that the door and windows were secure against the gusting snow. Every little detail mattered. He knew that even a small draft could make the room colder than it needed to be. Ayanna stayed near her parents, watching Ethan carefully. She noticed the way he moved, calm and steady, never panicking, never rushing, yet always doing exactly what needed to be done. Her eyes followed his hands as he adjusted the blankets, filled a small basin with water from the jug he had carried, and checked the food supplies. She had never seen anyone so prepared, so self-reliant, yet so gentle at the same time. "Are you always this careful?" she asked softly after a moment of silence. Ethan turned toward her, his face tired but calm. "You get used to it," he said simply. "Living out here, you learn that small mistakes can become big problems fast." She nodded slowly, understanding, but her eyes showed admiration. "I've never met anyone like you," she admitted quietly. "You saved us without asking anything in return." Ethan shrugged, as if it were nothing. "I couldn't leave you out there. You were too close to the storm. It was the right thing to do." Ayanna's gaze fell to the fire. She was thinking about how fragile life could be in the wild, and how easily a family could disappear in the snow. Her parents had been walking for hours, tired and cold, and she could still feel the fear in their voices when Ethan had first appeared. She realized how lucky they had been. A stranger had come at exactly the right time, and that stranger had risked his own safety for them. The old man stirred in his sleep, groaning slightly. Ethan glanced at him and went over to make sure he was comfortable. The elderly woman, Night Willow, had her hands wrapped in a blanket, and Ethan carefully checked them for signs of frostbite. Her fingers were red now, warm from the fire, but still slightly stiff. He gently massaged them to restore circulation. Running Bear murmured something under his breath, still asleep, but there was a faint hint of gratitude in his voice. Ayanna knelt beside her mother. "We should rest too," she whispered. "He's done so much already." Ethan moved to the corner of the cabin and pulled off his gloves, rubbing his hands together. He looked toward the young woman who was watching him quietly. "You should eat something," he said, handing her a bowl of warm broth. The steam rose, carrying the smell of vegetables and dried meat. She accepted it, sipping slowly, feeling the warmth spread through her body. The fire, the food, the blankets, it all felt like a miracle after hours of struggle in the cold. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're welcome," Ethan replied, looking away to hide the small smile forming on his face. He didn't often receive thanks like this, not in a way that felt meaningful. But somehow this family's appreciation touched him in a quiet way. As she ate, Ayanna asked, "How did you know where to find us? The storm came so fast." Ethan leaned against the wall, thinking for a moment. "I saw your tracks, and I know this land. I keep this cabin for emergencies. I figured you'd need shelter before the storm got worse." Her eyes widened slightly. You were prepared for this?" He nodded. "I never like being caught off guard. You never know when the weather will turn against you. Out here, preparation can save lives." Ayanna studied him for a while, impressed. She thought about how he had chosen to lead them to a place no one knew about. That choice had been completely unexpected. He could have taken them toward the nearest town, but instead, he risked his own solitude and privacy to protect strangers. That decision shocked her, and she realized that he had already earned their trust in ways she couldn't fully express. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the cabin, the world felt safer. The fire crackled and popped, the flames dancing across the walls and the shadows flickered gently. The elderly couple slept, their breathing slowing into deep, peaceful patterns. Ethan kept an eye on them, checking their positions, making sure they were comfortable. The cold could still creep in if they weren't careful. And he knew that one careless moment could undo all the safety he had worked so hard to provide. Ayanna, meanwhile, felt a strange sense of calm. She had spent so much of the day fearing for her parents' lives, for her own, that the sudden shift from terror to safety was almost dizzying. She watched Ethan move from task to task, noticing the quiet confidence he carried. There was no rushing, no panicking, no frustration, only determination to keep them alive. She had never met anyone with such steady courage. "I'm curious," she said finally, her voice breaking the silence. "Why do you help people you don't even know?" Ethan paused, leaning against the wall, his eyes on the flames. "I've learned that help is what matters most. Life can be short out here. People need each other. Sometimes, the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do, but it's worth it." Ayana's eyes softened. She looked at her parents, still sleeping, and then back at Ethan. His words made sense, but they also revealed something deeper. He didn't help them because he wanted recognition or reward. He helped because it was the right choice, because he couldn't ignore people in danger. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the fire and the wind outside. Then Ethan moved to prepare a small bed for Ayana beside the fire, using blankets and furs he had stored for emergencies. She sat on it, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, and let the warmth soak into her body. She felt protected in a way she had never known before. Ethan went back to check the elderly couple. Running Bear had stirred slightly and opened his eyes, blinking at the light and warmth. Ethan knelt beside him, adjusting the blanket and asking if he was comfortable. The old man nodded faintly, his voice hoarse but grateful. Night Willow shifted slightly, stretching her hands toward Ethan. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have saved us." Ethan simply nodded. "You're safe now. That's all that matters." Ayana watched, feeling a mixture of admiration and quiet awe. She had seen brave people before, but Ethan's courage was different. It wasn't loud or boastful. It was calm, steady, and focused entirely on helping others. She realized that this man had already changed their lives with his actions alone. As the night wore on, the storm continued outside, but inside the cabin, peace settled over them. The fire burned steadily, the blankets held warmth, and Ethan kept a watchful eye on everyone, ready to act if the weather threatened again. The elderly couple slept deeply, their breathing steady. Ayana sat quietly, reflecting on the events of the day. She felt safe, protected, and grateful beyond words. Ethan finally settled near the fire, sitting on a small stool and watching the flames dance. He thought about the journey ahead, the storm that had brought them together, and the choices he had made to protect them. Out here in the wild, every decision mattered, and tonight, he had done what he could to keep people alive. Ayana looked at him one last time, before closing her eyes, feeling a quiet sense of trust. She knew that whatever happened next, this cowboy had already proven himself. His courage, his kindness, and his ability to protect those in need were clear to her. The storm would eventually end, and the sun would rise again, but the memory of Ethan's bravery and selflessness would remain with them forever. The night stretched on, long and quiet, filled with warmth and safety, while outside, the world continued to rage in snow and wind. But inside the cabin, a bond had formed, quiet, unspoken, but stronger than words could express. Ethan remained vigilant, moving quietly from task to task, ensuring that everyone remained safe through the long night. Every small action mattered. Every choice he made could mean the difference between life and death in a world that could be cruel and unforgiving. But tonight, for these three people, he had made the right choices. By the time the first hints of dawn began to glow through the frosted windows, a sense of calm had settled over the cabin. The storm had not yet ended, but the fire, the blankets, and Ethan's careful watch had created a small haven in the midst of chaos. The young woman, her parents, and Ethan had all survived a night that could have been fatal, thanks to courage, skill, and kindness. Ayanna finally drifted into sleep, safe beside her parents, while Ethan continued his quiet vigil by the fire, thinking of what the morning would bring and how he would guide them to safety once the storm passed. It was another long night in the life of a cowboy, but one filled with quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had made a real difference in the lives of strangers who had become, in a small way, a part of his own story. Morning light finally began to touch the horizon, soft and pale through the frosted windows. The storm had slowed, though the wind still rattled the cabin walls, and the snow lay thick outside, untouched and bright. Ethan moved quietly, careful not to wake the elderly couple just yet. He checked the fire, added a few more logs, and made sure there was enough warmth for everyone as they prepared to leave. The cabin had been their refuge through the night, but now the real journey would begin, getting them safely to the settlement. Ayanna stirred first, blinking against the weak morning light. She had slept wrapped in blankets by the fire, but the memory of the storm was still vivid. Her parents slept quietly nearby, and for a moment she simply watched Ethan, who was carefully packing some supplies into a small bag. She noticed how calm and methodical he was, even after a night spent helping strangers survive a blizzard. She had never seen someone act so responsibly and with such quiet strength. "Good morning," Ethan said softly, turning toward her. His voice was gentle, though there was determination beneath it. "The storm has eased. We need to move soon." Ayanna nodded and helped her parents stir. Running Bear and Night Willow both groaned, adjusting their blankets, but they were much better than the night before. Their bodies had warmed, and the fire had brought some color back to their faces. Ethan went over to the elderly man first, helping him stand steadily on the floor. Night Willow followed, leaning on her daughter for support. The snow outside still glimmered, and though the storm had slowed, the landscape remained harsh and unforgiving. Ethan led them to Ranger, who was already waiting quietly outside the cabin. The horse snorted at the crisp morning air, shaking snow from his mane. Ethan stroked his neck before guiding the elderly couple onto the horse, one at a time. Ayanna helped her mother up first, steadying her, then assisted her father, who was stiff from the cold and exhaustion. Ethan offered Ayanna a hand, helping her climb onto the horse behind him. She hesitated, looking at him with a faint smile, realizing that she had learned to trust this man completely over the past night. Once they were all mounted, Ethan took the lead. The path through the snow was rough, and he moved carefully, ensuring that Ranger's steps were steady and that the horse did not slip on hidden ice. Ayanna held her parents firmly, keeping them balanced, while Ethan guided them through the drifts. The sun was rising higher, glinting off the snow and making the world sparkle in a way that almost seemed magical. For a moment, the hardships of the storm were replaced by a sense of hope. As they walked through the trees, Ayanna finally spoke. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "You risked so much for us. You didn't even hesitate." Ethan glanced back at her briefly. "I did what anyone should do. You were in danger. I couldn't leave you out there." She shook her head slightly. "No one else would have done that. Not many people would." Ethan's lips twitched with the hint of a smile. He didn't need praise, but hearing her words warmed him in a different way than the fire ever could. Maybe, but helping someone when they need it, that's what matters. Nothing else. The young woman stayed quiet after that, thinking about everything that had happened. She recalled the fear in her parents' eyes, the cold that had cut through them hours ago, and the sudden relief when Ethan appeared. He had become more than just a stranger to them. He had been a protector, someone who had turned a night of potential tragedy into survival. The trees began to thin as they moved toward the open plains. Snow crunched under Ranger's hooves, and the wind, though lighter, still carried a bite. Ayana looked around, realizing how far they had come. Her parents were both silent, watching Ethan carefully. Even Running Bear, who rarely showed emotion, had a look of deep respect in his eyes. Night Willow held her daughter's hand tightly, her lips pressed together in gratitude. Finally, after some time, the first sign of the settlement appeared on the horizon. A small cluster of buildings, smoke rising from chimneys, and the faint sound of morning activity. Ethan guided them carefully down the hill, making sure they approached safely. The elderly couple exchanged a glance, relief spreading across their faces. They had survived the storm, thanks to the cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere the night before. When they reached the edge of the settlement, Ethan stopped Ranger and helped the elderly couple down from the horse. Ayana followed, helping her parents steady themselves on their feet. The townspeople had begun to notice the small group arriving, some stopping to stare, others offering blankets and warm water. Ethan stayed back slightly, giving the family a moment to be greeted. Running Bear stepped forward, his expression solemn but full of gratitude. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You have honored us," he said slowly, his voice strong despite the lingering chill. "You protected us when no one else could. We will never forget your courage." Ayana looked at Ethan, her eyes shining with admiration. "You gave us your coat, your fire, your shelter. You saved our lives. We can never repay you." Ethan shook his head. "You don't need to repay me. Seeing you safe is enough." Night Willow came forward next, her hands clasped together. "May your days be long, Cowboy. You have shown kindness that is rare. You are a good man." The family's words touched Ethan in a quiet way. He had spent so many years alone on the plains, focusing on survival and work. Praise and gratitude were not things he often received, but he felt the weight of it now, not as a burden, but as a reminder that simple acts of kindness could have lasting effects. Ayana stepped closer and handed Ethan a small hand-woven cloth. "This was made by my grandmother," she explained softly. "It is given to those who show extraordinary kindness. Please take it. It is our gift to you." Ethan looked at the cloth, then back at her. He felt a lump in his throat, unaccustomed to receiving such personal tokens of appreciation. He accepted it with a nod. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I will treasure it." The family began to move toward the safety of the settlement buildings, each step more confident than the last. Ayana glanced back one final time at Ethan, feeling a mix of emotions: gratitude, awe, and something she could not yet name. She knew they would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Ethan watched them go, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. He had acted when it mattered most, and the result was clear. Lives had been saved, trust had been earned, and a bond had formed between strangers that would not be forgotten. The storm was still present in the wider world, but for this family, the threat had passed. For Ethan, it was another day in the life of a cowboy who lived by simple rules: protect, help, survive, and respect those who could not protect themselves. He finally turned back to the cabin, checking to make sure everything was in order before heading toward his own ranch. Ranger followed, shaking off snow as he moved. Ethan took one last glance at the settlement, watching the family enter safely, and felt a quiet pride. He had made a difference, and that was enough. The plains stretched before him, wide and open, still blanketed in snow, still wild and unforgiving. But he had done what mattered. He had been there when needed most, and the memory of that night, the blizzard, and the lives he had protected would stay with him forever. As he rode away, the sun fully rose over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the snowy landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world bright and sparkling, full of possibility. Ethan guided Ranger with steady hands, thinking quietly about the events of the past hours. Sometimes he realized courage was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and consistent. It was the kind of courage that saved lives. And for the elderly couple, for Ayanna, the memory of that cowboy who appeared in the blizzard would remain forever. A reminder that kindness, bravery, and selflessness could shine brightest in the darkest moments. Ethan rode on, alone once again, but with a sense of fulfillment and peace that only came from knowing he had done the right thing when it mattered most. The wind had softened, the snow sparkled in the morning sun, and the plains, vast and open, welcomed him back into their quiet embrace. He was a cowboy, a protector, a witness to lives forever changed by one simple choice: to help when it was needed most.